Stay with me. What I'm about to tell you could be the most important thing you hear this year. 90% of your suffering does not come from what that person did. It does not come from what they said, from how they left, from how they chose someone else, or from how they simply disappeared without explanation. 90% of your suffering comes from the attachment you have refused to release. And the moment you genuinely understand that, something shifts inside you that no outside event can undo. Think about it honestly. How many times have you lost your peace over someone who was not even thinking about you in that moment? How many nights have you replayed conversations that already ended, dissecting every word, searching for what you could have done differently? How many mornings have you woken up and felt that hollow weight in your chest before you even remembered why it was there? How many hours have you spent constructing imaginary scenarios, rehearsing arguments you will never have, or waiting for a message that may never come? And here is the part that cuts deepest. How many times have you felt, in the silence of your most honest moments, that without that person, your life simply loses its meaning? If you have felt that, I need you to hear something clearly and without cruelty. That feeling is not love, that feeling is attachment. And today we're going to talk about the difference, because that difference has the power to change the entire quality of your life if you let it land where it needs to land. This is not about becoming cold. It is not about learning to feel less, or about closing your heart off so nothing can hurt you again. People who teach you to feel less are not teaching you freedom. They are teaching you numbness, and numbness is not peace. What we are working toward today is something far more powerful and far more difficult. We are working toward learning to love fully, generously, and with your whole heart, without allowing that love to become a chain around your own neck. You are in the voice of the Stoic warrior, a space where we do not come to romanticize pain. We come to transform it into clarity. I want to speak to you not as a distant philosopher reciting ancient texts, but as someone who understands what it feels like to lose your equilibrium over another human being, and who chose, deliberately and with discipline, to train his mind so that it never has to happen that way again. So let us begin at the root. Attachment does not begin the moment you fall in love with someone. It begins the moment you start believing you need that person in order to feel whole. There is a critical distinction here that most people never examine closely enough, because examining it means confronting a deeply uncomfortable truth about where they have been placing their sense of self. When you love someone in a healthy way, you want good things for them. You want them to grow, to flourish, to be happy, and crucially, you want that even if their growth or their happiness takes them somewhere that does not include you. That is real love. It is generous and spacious, and it asks nothing in return except that the person you love is okay. Attachment is a completely different architecture. Attachment needs the other person in order to maintain its own internal stability. Attachment does not say, I want you to flourish. Attachment says, I need you here so that I can feel safe. It does not say, I love you freely. It says, I need your presence, your attention, your validation, your constancy, because without those things, something in me begins to collapse. And when that need structure goes up, fear moves in right alongside it. Fear that they will leave, fear that they will change, fear that they will find someone better, fear that you will be left alone. And when fear is the one driving, peace is no longer available to you. You can still be smiling, you can still be going through the motions of a normal day, but underneath it, the engine of anxiety is running constantly, burning through your energy, your clarity, your sense of self. Epictetus, the Stoic philosopher who was born a slave and became one of the most profound thinkers in human history, taught something that cut straight through the logic of attachment. He said that when you embrace your child or your partner, you should remember in that same moment that you are embracing a mortal human being, not a permanent possession. He was not saying this to make you love less. He was saying it so that you would learn to love with awareness, so that you would not construct your sense of stability on something that by its very nature is impermanent. Because here is what attachment does at a structural level. It converts the temporary into what feels like the indispensable. You meet someone, you connect. Your mind begins to project forward. It starts imagining shared moments, a shared future, a sense of steady companionship. It builds a story. And somewhere in the process of building that story, something shifts. That person stops being someone you share your life with and become someone you depend on for your life to make sense. The moment that transition happens, any signal of distance from them becomes a perceived threat to your entire system. That is why it hurts so much when someone pulls away, even slightly. It is not just the loss of their company, it is the loss of the sense of security you constructed around their presence. You are not just missing a person, you are experiencing what feels like the destabilization of your foundation. Marco Aurelius, writing in his private journals nearly 2,000 years ago, put it with characteristic directness. Everything you love, he wrote, is on loan from nature. Not guaranteed, not secured, on loan. Read that slowly because it is not a pessimistic statement. It is one of the most freeing ideas in the entire Stoic tradition. When you genuinely understand that nothing you hold is yours to keep forever, something opens up. You begin to appreciate without clutching. You begin to be present without the constant background hum of fear about when it might end. You can hold things, you can cherish them, but you can hold them lightly the way you might hold something exquisitely beautiful and fragile in an open hand rather than a clenched fist. The clenched fist does not protect what it holds. It only makes the loss more violent when it comes. Before I continue, one thing. If you are watching this, you already know the pattern. You feel the pull, you lose your ground, and later you ask yourself why you reacted that way again. There is a practical digital ebook called The Power of Not Reacting that deals with exactly this step by step. Subscribers get a limited time special discount. The link is in the first pinned comment. Before we go further, I need to say something important. The fact that you have experienced this kind of attachment is not a character flaw. It is not weakness. It is not a sign that something is fundamentally broken in you. Nobody teaches us to love without depending. Nobody sits us down when we are young and explains the difference between love and attachment. Instead, we are surrounded by a cultural infrastructure that teaches the opposite. Every romantic story we consumed growing up told us that finding the right person means finding our other half, finding the missing piece, finding the person who completes us. We are told that being alone is a kind of failure. We are told that if someone leaves, it is because we were not enough. That narrative is not just inaccurate, it is actively harmful. Because when you internalize the idea that another person is the source of your completeness, you have already positioned yourself for the particular kind of suffering that comes from attachment. You have made your psychological wholeness contingent on someone else's choices, someone else's consistency, someone else's decision to stay. Seneca warned that a person who depends on something external in order to be happy becomes a slave to that thing. If your peace depends on someone sending you a message, you are imprisoned by your own waiting. If your self-worth depends on someone choosing you, you are in permanent bondage to their opinion. If your emotional stability depends on another person's constancy, then you are structurally vulnerable to any change in their behavior, any shift in their feeling, any morning when they wake up differently than they did the day before. This does not mean you cannot love deeply. It means your identity cannot be held up by another human being. Your center cannot live outside yourself, because if it does, it is not really yours at all. Think about what attachment looks like on an ordinary morning. You wake up and the first thing you do is reach for your phone, not to check the news or the weather, to see if that person responded. If they did, and the response is warm, your day begins well. If they did not, or if the response is brief and seems distracted, your mood shifts. You carry that change into your work, into your interactions with other people, into the quality of your entire day. Throughout the day, your mind runs a constant background process of interpretation. A short reply becomes a reason for doubt. A slightly different tone becomes evidence of something shifting. An hour without contact feels like an absence. You are not fully present in your own life. You are living in a monitoring loop, perpetually scanning for signals about where you stand. That is attachment. And I want you to see it clearly without the overlay of self-judgment, because seeing it clearly is the first step toward actually changing it. Here is something worth sitting with for a moment, because it reframes the pain in a way that can begin to dissolve it. Ask yourself this question honestly. Are you suffering over that person? Or are you suffering over the story you had constructed about the future you were going to have with them? In many cases, what hurts most is not actually the loss of the person as they genuinely were. It is the loss of everything your mind had projected forward, the trips you imagined taking together, the way you thought your mornings would feel, the version of yourself you thought you were becoming in their presence, the sense of trajectory that their presence gave you. The person who is actually gone was a human being with limitations and inconsistencies and flaws. But the person you are grieving might be a construction that was always, to some significant degree, a product of your own hoping. The love was real. The connection was real. But the mind, when it attaches, has a tendency to select. It curates the memory. It amplifies the moments of warmth and minimizes the moments of doubt. It builds a highlight reel and then suffers over the highlight reel as though it were the complete and accurate picture of reality. Attachment makes you confuse presence with security. It makes you believe that without this particular bond, everything falls apart. But what the Stoic tradition keeps insisting, in every generation, is that your stability cannot have a single external anchor, because anything outside you can move, and if your foundation moves when it moves, you have not really built a foundation at all. Epictetus organized his entire philosophy around what is now called the Dichotomy of Control. He divided all of human experience into exactly two categories: things that depend on us, and things that do not depend on us. Things that depend on us include our judgments, our intentions, our values, our responses, our attention, our effort, our character. These are the only things we genuinely own, the only things that no person or circumstance can take from us without our consent. Things that do not depend on us include everything else: the behavior of other people, whether someone stays or leaves, whether someone loves us back, whether our expectations are met, whether the world arranges itself in the way we would prefer. Attachment is what happens when we violate this division, when we collapse the boundary between what is ours and what is not ours, when we take on responsibility for maintaining something that was never actually within our control. We believe that if we are good enough, attentive enough, patient enough, flexible enough, we can somehow keep the thing in place. We pour tremendous energy into trying to manage a situation that cannot be managed, because other people are not variables we can optimize. Other people are complete human beings with their own interior worlds, their own processes, their own evolution, and the price of that strategy is your peace. Here is the question to ask yourself right now. Not whether you can make that person come back, not whether you can make them understand what they lost. Ask honestly, what is actually within your power in this moment? You can choose how you interpret what happened. You can choose where you direct your attention. You can choose what kind of person you are going to be in the aftermath of this. You can choose whether this experience diminishes you or deepens you. Those choices are entirely yours, and they are the only ones that ultimately matter. Now let us get practical. Philosophy without application is just decoration. So here is what this looks like in the specific and ordinary moments when attachment flares up and the mind wants to pull you somewhere that will not serve you. The first tool is rational clarity, practiced the moment your mind begins to idealize. Every time you notice your mind constructing the perfect version of that person, stop and ask yourself a quiet, honest question. Am I seeing the actual person who existed in real life? Or am I seeing the version I built in my mind? Am I remembering everything, including the moments that gave me pause, the interactions that left me feeling unseen, the patterns that concerned me? Or am I curating? Attachment is almost always fed by an idealized image. When you bring the full picture back into view, the emotional intensity begins to settle, not because the good memories were not real, but because they were not the whole story. Write down what the relationship actually was, without the drama of the worst moments and without the glow of the best ones. Just the facts, as clearly as you can see them. Seeing it on paper interrupts the idealization process in a way that simply thinking about it cannot. This is exactly what Marco Aurelius did in his private journals. He examined his own perceptions and brought them back into alignment with reality, not to feel nothing, but to ensure his emotions were responding to what was actually true. The second tool is applying the dichotomy of control in real time. Every time you feel the urge to check their profile, to reach out to check if they have seen your message, run this quick sequence. Does it depend on me whether they come back? No. Does it depend on me whether they change? No. Does it depend on me how I interpret this situation and what I do with my energy today? Yes. That three-question sequence, practiced consistently, begins to retrain the automatic mental responses that send you toward your phone and away from your own center. The third tool is learning to sit with the discomfort of not reaching out when every part of you wants to. When you feel the urge to send the message, do not immediately suppress it or act on it. Sit with the feeling for a moment. Notice it as a sensation. Notice where it is in your body. Notice that it rises in intensity, and then, if you do not feed it with action, it begins to fall. Each time you choose not to act on the anxious impulse and survive the moment anyway, you are teaching your nervous system something essential. You are teaching it that the discomfort does not require rescue, that you can feel the pull and not be controlled by it. Epictetus said that we are disturbed not by things themselves, but by the opinions we have about them. The anxiety you feel when that person does not respond is not about the silence itself. It is about the story your mind is telling about what that silence means. And you can learn to examine the story rather than accept it automatically. The fourth tool is rebuilding your identity outside the relationship. Ask yourself honestly, what parts of your life did you quietly let diminish while you were orienting so much of your energy toward this person? What friendships became less central? What personal projects got postponed? What versions of yourself did you set aside? Rebuilding those areas is not distraction. It is not a shallow coping mechanism. It is the actual substance of becoming someone whose life does not depend on a single point of external support. When your life has multiple genuine pillars, work that matters, relationships that sustain you, practices that ground you, interests that engage you, one pillar shifting does not bring the whole structure down. The fifth tool is what Stoic philosophy calls negative visualization, and it is perhaps the most counterintuitive of all. In a quiet moment, bring your attention to the possibility that this person does not return, not as a worst-case scenario to dread, but as a reality to examine with steady eyes. Ask yourself, if this is simply what happened, if this is the end of this chapter, could I find my way forward? Could I build a life that is genuinely meaningful even without this particular person in it? If you sit with that question honestly, the answer is yes. You might not want it to be yes. A part of you might resist the yes because accepting it feels like a betrayal of the intensity of what you felt. But the yes is there. It has always been there. You were a complete human being with real capacities and genuine value before you met this person. Those capacities did not disappear when the relationship ended. They are still yours. Negative visualization does not cultivate hopelessness. It reduces the power of anticipatory fear. When you have already faced the possibility and found that you could survive it, the fear of it loses much of its grip. One of the places where attachment sustains itself most invisibly is in the language we use inside our own heads, the internal narrative, the things we say to ourselves when no one else is listening. Pay attention to how you describe your own situation to yourself. Do you say things like, "I cannot be happy without this person, I cannot get through this, nothing feels worth anything when they are not there"? That kind of language is not just a description of how you feel. It is an active instruction to your own mind. It tells your psychological system that the assessment is accurate and permanent. The Stoic practice here is a specific and deliberate shift. Instead of "I cannot be happy without this person," practice saying, "I would prefer to have this person in my life, and I can be okay without them." Instead of "nothing matters if they are not here," practice saying, "This matters to me, and I am capable of finding what matters even in their absence." The difference between "I cannot" and "I prefer" is not cosmetic. It is architectural. "I cannot" positions you as a passive victim of your own feelings, someone for whom the outcome is already determined. "I prefer" positions you as someone with genuine wants and genuine autonomy, someone who is making choices rather than being swept along by circumstances. Preference is honest. Preference can coexist with real pain. Preference does not erase how much something mattered, but preference does not enslave you the way need does. Not every feeling needs to be communicated. Not every thought needs to be expressed. In the context of attachment, one of the places where people do the most damage to themselves is in acting on the impulse to reach out when the real motivation is not connection, but anxiety relief. You feel the anxious need for contact. You send a message. You feel temporarily better. The anxiety returns. The cycle reinforces itself. And with each iteration, you are teaching your system that the only way to manage the feeling is through contact with that person, which means the dependency deepens. Before reaching out, ask yourself honestly, is this about genuine connection and something I want to say that needs to be said? Or is this about managing my anxiety for the next 20 minutes? If it is the latter, find a different way. Move your body. Call someone who genuinely sustains you. Write in your journal. Sit in the discomfort until it passes, because it will pass. The things we choose not to say are often as important as the things we say. Here is what understanding this changes nothing on its own. You can follow the logic of everything said here and still reach for the phone at 2 in the morning. Clarity without structure does not hold. The practical ebook. The power of not reacting was built for exactly that gap, the space between knowing and actually doing differently. Subscribers currently have access to a 37% discount. It is a limited time offer. The link is in the first pinned comment. There is a moment in the process of genuine release that you may not recognize immediately when it arrives. It does not announce itself. There is no dramatic revelation, no particular morning where you wake up transformed. It comes quietly, almost sideways. You think of that person, and the tightening in your chest is not quite as sharp. You find yourself in a place you associated with them and notice that you are, to your own mild surprise, simply present in the place rather than lost in the memory. You go through a morning without thinking of them first. You catch yourself engaged with your own life in a way that does not require comparison to what you used to have. That is not emptiness. That is freedom. And it is the result not of the passage of time alone, but of the deliberate inner work you did during the passage of time. Marcus Aurelius wrote that tranquility comes from aligning your mind with reality, not fighting what is true, not spending your energy wishing things were otherwise, not organizing your interior life around the hope of an external change that may never come, but seeing what is, accepting what is, and finding within that acceptance the spaciousness to move. What you are moving toward is a version of yourself that loves without possessing, that values without depending, that is present in relationships without making any single relationship the entire basis of your existence. This version of you does not love less. It loves without the constant undercurrent of fear. It gives without the constant calculation of what is being given back. It connects without the desperate need to hold on. That is not an unfeeling life. That is a deeply engaged life. And the difference between the two is the difference between a life organized around anxiety and a life organized around genuine presence. Seneca said that the wise person finds sufficiency within themselves, not because they have stopped needing or wanting, not because they have become an island, but because they have stopped outsourcing their inner stability to things that cannot provide it permanently. Think about the life that becomes available to you when that shift happens. You wake up in the morning, and the quality of your day does not depend on a message. You enter new relationships without the invisible weight of needing them to rescue you from something. You make decisions based on your own values and your own clarity, rather than based on fear of loss. You recognize when a connection is genuinely good for you, because you are no longer so hungry that anything seems nourishing by comparison. That is not a small thing. That is the architecture of a genuinely good life. Many people working through attachment are doing so without what we might call a clean ending. The relationship did not have a definitive conversation, a clear conclusion, a mutually understood close. Things became ambiguous, or distant, or someone simply faded out of the picture without an explanation that makes sense. The absence of a formal ending makes the process of letting go psychologically harder, because the mind resists closing what was never formally acknowledged as over. It keeps returning to the ambiguity. It keeps wondering whether the story might still be in progress, whether the last chapter has actually been written. Epictetus, and the Stoic tradition more broadly, would say that waiting for an external event to grant you closure is another form of placing your peace in the hands of something outside your control. Closure is not something another person gives you. Closure is something you decide for yourself. There are ways to assist that decision. Write a letter you will never send, in which you say everything that needs to be said, not for them to read, but for you to say. Acknowledge what was real, what was good, what you learned, what you are carrying forward, and what you are choosing to release. Create a deliberate and conscious moment of completion, not because gestures are magic, but because the mind responds to symbol and ceremony in ways it does not respond to pure intellectual decision. The brain needs markers. It needs moments it can recognize as endings so that it can begin the process of reorientation. You do not need the other person to be present for that marker. You can create it yourself, and then really understand, what Stoic philosophy means by the word release. Release does not mean forgetting. It does not mean that what happened did not matter, or that the person did not matter. It means that you are choosing to stop tying your present well-being to something you cannot change. It means that the past is the past and you are here, now, in a present that is still fully alive and still fully yours. Ask yourself, and let the question sit rather than rushing to answer it. If that person had never come into your life, would you still be capable of building something meaningful? Of course you would. The answer is not even close. You were building things before they arrived. You had capacities and dreams and a particular way of seeing the world that belonged entirely to you. None of that was created by them, and none of it was destroyed by their leaving. It is still there waiting for you to come back to it. Attachment sometimes disguises itself as destiny. It tells you that this was the only person, the only chance, the only version of the future that could have worked. But that is not destiny speaking. That is pain speaking, and pain, as Epictetus would tell you, is almost always speaking about the story you are telling rather than the reality you are in. The reality is that you are here, that you chose to seek something more useful than suffering. That is not nothing, that is in fact everything. Because from that decision, from that choice to direct your attention toward clarity rather than toward the loop of the wound, everything else becomes possible. You do not need to stop loving people. You need to stop building your peace on top of them. Your peace is yours, it was always yours. And every time you choose to act from your own center, rather than from the anxiety of losing something outside it, you are not just recovering from this particular loss. You are becoming someone who does not lose themselves in loss anymore. Remember this always. To love is to share. To be attached is to depend. And to depend is to hand your stability to something you cannot control. You were not born to live in constant anxiety over another person. You were born to develop character, clarity, and self-mastery. So the next time you feel that impulse to seek approval, to reach out from fear of losing, to hold on from insecurity, stop and ask yourself one honest question. Am I acting from love or from fear? That single question can change everything. Most people hear something like this, feel the shift, and then 2 days later, the same trigger arrives and the same reaction follows. Insight without a daily structure does not interrupt a pattern that has been running for years. The Power of Not Reacting is a practical digital ebook with concrete tools for exactly those moments. Subscribers get a 37% discount, limited time. The link is in the first pinned comment. You are not losing your world. You are recovering yourself. If this message helped you see something more clearly, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to Stoic Reset Hub and keep walking with us toward a life where peace depends on no one but the quality of your own inner work.